Chapter 12, Section 1. We're going to talk about the Tang and the Song dynasties of China. So we're starting off by talking about China in general during this period, which is also known as the Middle Ages by the Europeans, also known as the Dark Ages. Ironically, during this time period, all other parts of the world, whether it be the Arab world, to a certain degree the African parts of the world, and of course the Chinese, were in fact prospering. They're doing very well. And we'll go on to talk about what they did well as some of the reasons why they didn't do so well, and why the Tang and the Song dynasty would eventually fall. The Tang ruled for about 300 years, and all these achievements began when Tang Taizong, Taizong or Taizong, sorry if I'm not pronouncing it right, begun to build this great dynasty. Now, in the 600s, the Tang would slowly expand their size, and they would go on to even get as far as what would be the Silla Kingdom back then, and they would control the Silla Kingdom as a tributary state. So the Silla still were able to govern themselves with their own leaders, but they had to pay tribute to the Chinese. This is also known as a tributary state. Now, Chinese bureaucracy was being set up then, and this was one way the Chinese made sure to keep and make sure that their very large dynasty was being controlled well and efficiently. And one way to do this was to make sure those who were part of the bureaucracy were those who were the best, the cream of the crop, the best of society. And the way they did this was through a big examination known as the civil service examination. In theory, this type of system was meant to get the best of everyone, but in reality, the only people who had the time and the resources to study for these tests were the wealthy. So really, you're only getting the best of the wealthy people. For everyone in the middle bottom, the bottom society didn't really have the time to study for these tests. Now, what's incredibly interesting about these civil service exams, which took place over 10 centuries ago, is today in the 21st century, this culture lives on in East Asia. When I say East Asia, I'm referring to China, Japan, and South Korea, where, for example, when you want to get into universities in these countries, you have a national exam. So, for example, in Japan or in South Korea, there's one exam the seniors take their senior year, and that one exam score decides what university to get into, a very high-pressure one exam system. Now, like the Chinese and the civil service exam, the idea here is that everyone is taking the same test, the exact same test at the same time, therefore it's as fair as it can be. But in reality, the problems are actually the exact same problems that existed 1400 years ago. And this is that, well, obviously the student who has the money to hire a $100 hour tutor, for 10 hours a week is probably going to do better on this test than the student who can't go to a tutor or doesn't have money to go to cram school, and so on. So it's very interesting to see how this culture continues to live on under the same ideas, but it still also has the same issues that have not been resolved for over 1,000 years. However, it is not all negative. One positive is compared to 1,000-something years ago, where the farmers were not even able to take the exam. At least nowadays, everyone can at least take the exam, even if one person per se has a much better advantage because they're able to hire private tutors while others had no tutoring at all. Now, as the dynasty grew, the size and population also grew, and statistics show that the state was over 50 million people at the time. To give you an idea how big that is, that's almost the size of Italy today. Now, the Tang Dynasty had many achievements, whether it's their contribution in medicine, various inventions like the printing techniques, and cultural achievements such as in the arts and poetry. One of their major lasting legacies was this concept of social mobility. So the idea of social mobility is that someone could be born from a lower class but eventually rise up in social classes. Now, as I mentioned earlier, for the most part, this was very difficult. If you're a farmer, you just simply did not have the resources or time someone from the upper class did to take the civil service exam. With that said, there was still a possibility that you could take that exam and slowly crawl up the ranks. Unlike, per se, the Middle Ages Europe during the time, where if you were a peasant, that was it. You were going to farm, you're going to stay in your little crook house, and there was no way you were going to become a knight suddenly 10 years later, right? Because knights were already training from age 7. Finally, a very interesting statistic for you. The Tang Dynasty controlled almost half of the world's wealth at its peak. That is quite a bit. If you consider China, a mega power today, only controls about 18%. 40% of the world's wealth is quite a bit. All right, very quickly, a few other accomplishments. There's obviously the Silk Road that helped trade with Europe and other parts of the world. During this time, we also saw Chinese monks make it to Japan, where they're able to culturally exchange and help teach the Japanese about things like Buddhism. We also see cities filling with trades and merchants, and there's all these different items being sold. And it goes back to that concept of meritocracy. There's more freedom for people to be able to sell stuff, to buy stuff. Now things begin to slowly fall apart in the 9th century from a combination of things. So first of all, we have the closing of trade. So after hundreds of years of trades with various parts of the world, by the early 9th century, foreigners were no longer welcome in China. And part of this had to do with xenophobia, part of this had to do with conflicts that had been looming between the Chinese and the foreigners, and the government just decided, they didn't want to deal with these problems anymore, so they're just going to ban all foreigners. And other reasons why the Tang fell were internal issues. So there were taxes that created internal dissent. During this time, to make matters worse, there were enormous floods in 858. There were other natural disasters, which made people, this goes back to a concept I've mentioned before, the mandate of heaven. People felt like this was God's sign that they no longer wanted the Tang Dynasty to be in charge. They were not able to recuperate, and by the turn of the 10th century, the capital was raided, the emperor was murdered, and that was officially the fall of the Tang Dynasty. Copyright disclaimer under Section 107 and blah blah blah. Have an excellent day. Goodbye.